Okay, good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. This is going to be our training on the first part of remote sensing and journalism. I'm seeing some people still joining. It's a great pleasure to meet you. I'm work at the Pulitzer Center with our colleagues Leonor, Harry, Nora, and Yelter, who are also in this call. I am the environmental investigations editor of a network called the Rainforest Investigations Network. Probably you've heard a little bit about it, which is a sister initiative of the Rainforest Journalist Fund. So we do complementary work. The main difference is that the RIN does fellowships instead of grants. So many of you here might be interested to apply for a fellowship that will be open by the end of the year. So these fellowships are 1-year fellowships for investigating issues related to the rainforests, in the three regions, the Amazon, the Congo Basin, and the Southeast Asia regions. And today I'm going to bring a little bit of my experience working in the Amazon region mainly. I'm Brazilian. I'm based here now in São Paulo. Done a lot of my work in the Amazon region, and some of the examples that I'll show of stories that I've done myself and are from the Amazon, and hopefully gonna be useful for you to apply also in the forests of Southeast Asia. Well, I think we can jump right away into the training. The first thing that I'm gonna ask you for us to start is a little exercise. It won't be painful. It's a simple exercise. So this exercise is basically you think on about a place that comes to your mind. Just stick to this place. It might be a place where you've done a story, or you like to do a story, or it's your home place, or it's a place that you love and you like to be there now, or it may be a place that you don't like. Any place that comes to your mind. So this is the first question. And after that, the other question that I want you to start thinking is, if you have to tell the story of this place or some characteristics of this place, features, highlights of this place to someone, how you would do that? What kind of features, as I said, would you highlight to your listeners, right? So keep these questions, keep thinking about this place, because this will help us to go through the exercise today. Because basically I'll start sharing my screen. This session, it's called remote sensing and journalism, but let me open here, sorry. But pretty much we could call this session also, okay. The story of a place, how to tell a story of a place. And why is that? Is because if we're talking about environmental journalism or environmental reporting, the place has a central place, right? Has a central importance in your narrative. When we learn journalism, we learn all those questions, what, who, where, which are the key questions a reporter should do. But when we're talking about environmental journalism, the where question is very important, because the natural environment is really a central character of the story. You're not only telling about the conflicts and the communities and the people and the political and economic issues. You're talking a lot about that environment that it was affected, or sometimes you're describing a conservation area. So I think that's why I ask you to come out with a place in your mind that if you want to talk about the environment, you should depict, or you should know this place, you should know the environment very well and know how over the agenda for you to know what we're gonna do to achieve this goal of telling the story of the place. I'm gonna start with a quick introduction about what is geodata and the possible analysis. Also, after that, we'll go and work with Google Earth Pro, which is a very useful tool to start and also to continue working with this geodata and some possible analysis. It's very interesting also to consider the ability of locating yourself or your content to be able to mix layers. And finally, I'm going to show some of the satellite data platforms that can be very useful for us to find updated medium and high resolution imagery for your reporting. On this link, and I should ask maybe Leonor if you can help me on sharing on the chat the link of the presentation, same one that I share with you. On this agendas slide, you will find the link for the folder with files that I'm going to use today on Google Earth and some of the Sentinel imagery. So on the file, we'll find on the folder, we'll find these two subfolders. And by getting into this first folder, for example, of Google Earth, you will find all the files that you can upload. So while I'm doing the exercise, you also can follow with me, and that's going to be helpful. Okay, so I hope you have thought about the place you want to tell a story. I'm going to start giving you some ideas for doing this. So let's start with the importance of using geodata in journalism and why we see more and more media outlets and journalists using satellite imagery and geospatial analysis in their reporting. And the main reason is that it's a very effective way of telling stories, especially environmental stories about change. Because if the environment, the ecosystem is your character, this character needs, like the proper approach to be depicted. So to tell the story about the change, you need to consider the proper space and time of that ecosystem. So look at this image on the right, for example. If we're talking about a glacier retreat, it's very useful to use almost 40 years of satellite imagery to show how it changed over time. So if you're talking about a huge ecosystem, it's worth considering, like the spatial dimensions, the size. If you're looking at the whole Mekong basin, or you're looking at the whole Amazon basin, and the time that is considered for the change. So here we're talking about 40 years of change, like this glacier in Canada is retreating over 40 years, but sometimes the frequency is about the fast pace of change. So if you're talking about the deforestation, and you see that over a year, a huge area has changed, that's a story, right? 1,000 hectares just disappear overnight. That's a story. Here, what do you think is this that has appeared in the middle of this desert, looks like, in 6 months in Uganda? Can you please help me to bring some hypotheses? What can just pop up in the territory in 6 months like this? Any ideas what this could be? You can unmute, or you can put it here in the chat. Any ideas? No one? Okay. So this is a refugee camp. Thanks, Kank. That's right. Exactly. This is a refugee camp in the border of Uganda and DRC. And so you can see how useful Yeah, and refugees, I can see just that your message here. You both right, King and Josette, and that's a story that can be told by using satellite imagery. How fast was the displacement of these refugees from the DRC to the Uganda? So you can see this using this high resolution imagery of planet. So what you can consider in this case is the frequency, right? How fast this has happened, and dimensions. So for helping us to conceptualize what are the kind of analysis that you can do considering the space, like the, the geo characteristics of the analysis, I propose that you consider the resolution. So you will tell a story about maybe it's one place, one city, or you can tell a story about one state. So that would be regional, one um, um, region in like the Southeast Asia region or the Amazon region, or sometimes you can do like a ecosystem resolution, looking at um, the basin or a hotspot of biodiversity. I found very interesting, for example, one of the projects that you probably know is the third pole, based in, I think most of the team is in India and Nepal, but it's interesting that their uh, lenses, the way they decided to focus their stories is dividing by basins, right? So you have the Ganga basin and others in that region. So it's a ecosystem resolution for telling the stories. Or if we're talking about climate change, we're considering even a global resolution. I'm using resolution here in a very journalistic term because like it just frame the geography that you want to tell the story. And of course, there are other concepts of resolution like the satellite resolution. And I should mention that. Let me jump into this link that I'm going to also share with you that tells what is the spatial resolution of a satellite data. So if you're talking about the satellite itself, we usually talk about 10 meters resolution. So you basically should consider a pixel, and its size of that pixel would represent the space in meters. So here you can see, hopefully you can see that a satellite that is considered low resolution would have a pixel that will represent 60 meters, a medium resolution 10 to 30 meters, and high or very high resolution 30 centimeters to 5 meters. So you see that you can actually use very precise and accurate satellite imagery when you have this high resolution. So this is a good resource for understanding. And for all these resolutions, you might find um, free satellite imagery out there, although the very high resolution is not so common. Like the one I was showing about Uganda, which is a company called Planet. They provide 30 centimeters to 5 meters satellite imagery. And the more accurate satellite image is not actually available for free. But let me jump on the other things that you can consider when doing this kind of analysis or exercise of geospatial analysis. So you should consider time, for example, how frequent something happens in that territory. What's the duration of that phenomenon? And the changes that you can compare, the famous before and after. Frequency is really useful for measuring the pulse of rivers, or like the frequency of forest fires, or the frequency of any event that will affect that environment. Same thing for the duration. The changes before and after, you probably have seen many of those sliders that allow you to compare, like I was showing the glacier. And we'll see how to do this with our tools today as well, both Google Earth Pro and Sentinel. And finally, the space element on your analysis. There's so many possibilities. I just mentioned some of the most common ones. You can measure the distance between things, and that it's very useful for stories. Last year, I saw many stories measuring, for example, the distance of communities to hospitals and ventilators, for example. What is the distance between an indigenous territory and the closest ventilator during this time of pandemics? This is a spatial analysis that is useful in this moment. Or the size and the dimensions, that's a key thing, you know, like you want to compare the relevance of an event. You'll say the size of this deforestation is equal to the size of a city in Europe or something. You will find the comparison for showing the relevance of that size, the dimension of an event. It's very important to represent. And finally, one very common analysis to consider is all kinds of intersection. So there's the intersection of a polygon of deforestation in a protected area. There's a certain number of forest fire points within indigenous territories. So you can overlay things and start counting and seeing if they intersect. For stories about the rainforest, this kind of analysis are key because there's a lot of issues of not only deforestation within protected areas or some kind of a territory that we want to analyze, but there's also issues of claiming for land. So this is a very useful analysis we did when looking at invasions of indigenous territories in Brazil. We would ask how many farmers are claiming land within that territory. So how many of these polygons of the properties are intersecting with the indigenous territories. So think about this kind of overlays that you can do. And that's actually my next slide. You should use, in my opinion and my suggestion, a layer mindset when dealing with geospatial data sets. And that's the way you will profile your place. If you're thinking, again, I ask you to think about the place you would like to tell the story, how you will tell the story about this place to someone else. Think about layers, right? Which indicators do you know or do you have available to depict, to create a profile of that place? If I'm talking about the Amazon region, I would think, what's the size? What's the protected areas that exist there? There's another layer. What are the indigenous territories that existing there? Maybe I want to look at the income, deforestation rate, forest fires rate, and finally, even your stories. If you collect many stories and points that you can connect to these layers, you're creating a kind of a dialogue between the data and the stories, where are giving context to the data and the data is giving context to the story. So when you're building your maps, you can always have this layered mindset. And we will see that using Google Earth Pro, the other tool that I'm going to show you, it's from NASA, it's called the Word View. The mindset is always like, I'm going to pile some layers and compare things, comparing in the sense that how many things intersect and so on. And even if you're thinking not only on a huge ecosystem, if you're thinking about a single place, you can apply this layer mindset. Think about your own household, your own home. You can start thinking on the layers that will tell the story of your of your home, like what's the consumption of energy, what's the consumption of water, what's the median income, and so on and so on. In maps, this can be represented graphically, and now we should consider maps as the language that will help you to tell the story of a place. When we want to depict, we want to give a profile of a place, definitely maps are the best way of doing this. This is a historically recognized language of depicting a place. And I would say a little bit more by also saying that I think maps nowadays is probably the language, the new skill, or the new language really, that is more accepted, if you like, in the digital space. Why is that? Because we've been using a lot of applications like Waze or Uber, whatever, there's so many applications on your mobile that are based on maps and this digital geography representation, that more and more people understand how to read maps. And when I'm talking about using satellite imagery for doing your stories, you can use them as an analytical tool. You can do the analysis and extract data from there, but you also can tell stories with this techniques. And I will show some examples here. And that it's more accepted and understood in these days. I remember years ago when we started to do the work of Info Amazonia, which is a project that I'm related to, or I helped to create almost 10 years ago, which brings this idea of representing stories in maps. A good friend of mine said, like, I like your project, but I don't like maps a lot. I don't know how to read maps. And that's okay. A lot of people might not like maps. But as I was saying, as applications keep growing using Google Maps or Waze and many others that this language of seeing a map or of understanding a map is becoming much more current. And so that's why we think it's very useful. And we've been using a lot on the work we are doing at Rainforest Investigations Network. We see a lot of the RGF stories also using this language of representing stories with layers. To be a bit more specific, I'll show you quickly some examples. So the first one is from ProPublica, a newsroom in the US. They did this work with a newspaper in Louisiana, United States, where they tell how the delta of the Mississippi River is losing land because of the rise of the sea level rise. It's interesting thinking about that idea that if we want to tell the story of the environment, you have to go years back, like you should consider a time scale that's sometimes different from a fact. This is totally true when you look at here that they go back to 1922 to tell the story of how things are changing and go up to the 2014. But you can basically explore the story using the map. So the story is here, right? And at the same time, you can see the change over time. It's pretty amazing. And you see how the land in these areas is disappearing. I can see, for example, how a technique like this would be really useful for telling the story. I've seen good stories, amazing stories about some of the land that is being reclaimed by the sea in the delta of the Mekong, and I can see how these two projects, or this technique can be applied for that region too. So if you browse here, you see the change in the land, and at the same time you have the story here to give the context to the data. One other example that I like a lot is this project done by the Seattle Times, also an American media outlet, which won the Pulitzer Prize award a few years ago. And this is just the data visualization of the story. The story is much longer, but what it tells is the story about one place, one single neighborhood where 40 people died because of a mudslide. And and the title tells us everything. The analysis they did, going back to the 19th century, shows that there was a lot of changes, man-made changes in the territory that led to that disaster. So thinking about, layers and tagging the territory, this is another concept that's very interesting. Like you're looking at your place, that place that you thought, and what are the ways of you annotate and tag the territory. That's what they're doing. So you start going to this timeline and then bring like image from the 1930s. This is a aerial image showing that place that was already being intervened by. Some houses were built, some photos showing that there was already some sliding on the hill, and they go and go, and every year they start showing how things were happening there. 1955 there was another slide, until they get to the point to show that the neighborhood was built in that same area, all the houses here, until they get to the major disaster in 2014, which unfortunately have killed all these people. So it was a very good story to contextualize the territory, bring the satellite imagery, like to go back to the many decades ago and not stay with the narrative that was an isolated event. I will insist on this idea that if you want properly tell the story of a change of a place, it's better looking back or considering this geospatial elements of looking at time and space in a different way, and then you will represent more accurately some of this environmental change. Another example is this one, which is a mix of a story and a study done by this organization called Forensic Architecture. This story ended up also being used by the BBC. You have the link for Exploring Born, but it's very interesting that they bring various layers to show that what was happening in some islands of Indonesia was a major event affecting all the region in terms of emissions of carbon dioxide and pollution. Here they're focusing more on the palm oil sector, but the interesting part of the story is showing how fires affect all the regions. So they're using, for example, a carbon cloud, satellite data here, and comparing with the layers of the areas that were deforested by one company. So here you can see all the palm oil plantation within the territory, the concession, and keeps bringing more and more, and using the idea, one of things that you can do also is like create buffers. So here in the case, they create a buffer around the area of concessions to prove that they were invading areas that were outside of their concessions, that kind of satellite imagery. Other layers related to the palm oil concessions in Indonesia. So here is not so visually impactful, but you can see they mix various indicators from carbon emissions coming from one satellite data to the more localized concession up to looking at the whole region with the moratorium of palm oil. So many layers that you can combine to tell the story. And finally, the last example, which has become one of my favorite projects, it was supported by the Pulitzer Center. This project is called Neglected and Unmapped, which is an effort of doing a story and at the same time mapping a neighborhood called Makoko. in Lagos, which is a flooding. It's a flooding neighborhood, which is very interesting. But surprisingly, although it's so big, you cannot see it. I'm gonna show you here. You cannot see it in Google Maps. Look at this is the Google Maps of this neighborhood, and this is what is actually is in OpenStreetMap. So the interesting thing about this story is that while telling the story about the people who lives there and the neighborhood, they also mapped all these houses and other infrastructure that exists in this neighborhood. And the way of doing this is basically putting GPS in the hands of people, and what they do is really classifying the infrastructure, how many churches there are, how many health facilities and other schools and waste dump sites. It is the proper geo analysis, because you actually mapping things and creating the story. And what I love about this story is because support something that I really believe, and I would share with you, is that while doing our stories, we kind of telling in real time the story of that territory, that place again. So we journalists, we can see ourselves as kind of cartographers as well. I like to say modern cartographers, because we're telling the story in real time, helping to give context to those territories and what are happening there. So you can also do this by, geotagging your content. And that's my next, already starting a little bit on our training aspect of our meeting. I would start with this skill of geolocating yourself. So my question here for all of you is, if I ask you to give me the coordinates where you are, how you would do that? Do you know how to geolocate yourself? What is behind this question is like, do you know how to geolocate your content? If you have to go in the field to do your reporting, do you know how to input coordinates on your pictures and get the track of your boat trip or the track that you did in the forest? Sometimes it's better to have a proper GPS, because forests are complicated environments to connect with GPS. So a good GPS it's an option. There are cheap ones that work really well, and they're very good battery wise. They don't spend many batteries. But you also can use apps. I like use this Wikiloc that's available for both Apple and Android, but there's so many others. It's just like you look for GPS for your phone, you probably would find. The good thing about Wikiloc is that although you have to register and be part of a network, let me see what's in the chat. I'm gonna answer you just that. I'm just mentioning, so the Wikiloc allows you to put geotag your pictures and grab your track. And even if you're not using internet on the ground, you can still record things. The only thing is you won't see the maze map. You will see only your track, but that's not a problem as long as it's recording. So Gisette is asking, I hope I'm saying your name correct. Sorry if I'm not, but if it's getting coordinates through Google Maps is accurate? Yeah, it is pretty accurate. What happens sometimes is that the projection that is used on Google Maps, which is called Google Mercator, it's a projection that they created to show maps on the internet, would conflict with some data sets when you come to mix your layer with other layers. For example, you want to get the deforestation layer of a provider like the government of your country. Sometimes the projections are different, and so you might see yourself walking outside of of the road or outside of the protected area that you thought you were. So it's good then to reproject the layer that is not fitting with your location, and that's possible to do on QGIS. It's not really complicated. So you can use this to geotag, and I'm gonna emphasize the importance of geotag your content. Even if you're not using in a visual way, it allows you to do this kind of comparisons. You know, like you have a collection of stories, that's an expression that I like, that you can later compare with other indicators. For many outlets, that might not be important. I think for the work we do as a network in the Pulitzer Center might be really important in the future. The work that I've done in Info Amazonia was quite interesting to grasp or to look at this collection of stories of 2 or 3 years and then see if we did enough stories about a place that is having high deforestation, or have we covered enough an area of transformation because of a huge hydroelectric power plant. So it's a way of transforming your stories. If you're coordinating an outlet or your own stories through the years, it's transforming all this collection of stories in data itself, because then you can compare these stories with other indicators to see if there's context for those places you would like or you want to represent and tell the stories. The other thing that is interesting for combining your on the ground perspective and other data is that you can do this very well-known technique of zooming in and out. That is for years a very, well, I don't know how many years, but it's a very common storytelling technique, right? You start with a case and then you zoom out and show how relevant this case is. One example is like, you can tell the story of one person, I don't know, John, every morning eats bread and butter with coffee. That's his story, that's the case. But then you zoom out and say like John, thousands of people in this country eats bread and butter and coffee. So you gives the relevance by zooming out. So like John is not the only one. There's the relevance of this event. And by geotagging your stories, you can also do this with these indicators. You're showing like, this is this protected area, but then I'm zooming out, flying out, and seeing the whole context, seeing the whole ecosystem, seeing the whole basin, and so on. Similarly, you can start the other way around. You're looking at the basin and then you approximating. In the visual terms, this is really useful. And you, again, see this everywhere nowadays, from the CNN approaching that location with Google Earth, you know, like when you see that report, now we're going to fly to Syria, and they zoom in to, you know, like this combination of resolutions from the hyper local to a kind of a global view of the environment. So think about combining these resolutions. I'll show you one example on how I use this myself on a story I did 5 years ago for Info Amazonia about this hydroelectric power plant called Belo Monte, which in the Mekong is the second largest dam in the world, or the third, not sure. But there was a huge project affecting a river that's called the Xingu River and many indigenous people. So just prior the closure of the dam, they had the dam built, but they will start creating the reservoir. We made an expedition with indigenous people on this river. So we really went on the river rowing for 4 days. In this trip, actually, there was an RJF member, Eliane Brum, who is part of the Amazon committee, was also in this expedition. So we were for 4 days rowing with these indigenous people to see the impacts of the transformation. So this was my guide, whose name is Cobalto, very wise man. He, while we were rowing, I was listening to him, and it was telling me that how things would change in the river, how fish would disappear, because he knew from living there for years, the pulse of the river would change. Let me see, there's apparently a question here. Okay. While we were there in the river, we would see things like this. Was islands being the forest prior to the reservoir, the filling of the reservoir. This is not illegal, it's actually legal by the environmental impact assessment. You had to clear all the area of the reservoir for avoiding methane emissions. But while I was rowing there, going on with the indigenous people and talking with them on the boats, on the canoes, I was tagging everything with my GPS. So I was tagging these areas of deforestation. I was tracking my route on the river and other things that I would see, like this canal was the main area of dispute, because this is a huge 20 kilometers channel that would divert water from the indigenous land. So this story was mainly about this. It was about the indigenous lands downstreams staying without water, or having no control of the amount of water they would get after the dam was filled, and that would affect fisheries and many other things you can imagine. So this is again the channel on my GPS, and finally the dam itself when we get in front of it. So I want to show you the final result of the map. It's not beautiful, unfortunately. The interactive map is not available anymore, but that's going to be the basis of our first demonstration on how to use Google Earth. So this is the area that we visit. The red line is the track, the 100 kilometers track that we row for 4 days. All these points are areas of deforestation or other things that I would see while rowing there, geotagging the photographs and the content. And finally, I got a update satellite imagery of that scar in the middle of the bend of the river, which is exactly that channel diverting water to you can see an icon on the top of the image. That is where the turbines are. So the water would be diverted through this channel and then go into the turbines. The problem is that indigenous territories this you cannot see it fully, but there's orange things by the river on the bottom of the image. So for me, it was really important to get back from this trip to upload my GPS tracks on Google Earth and having the whole context of the area. It allowed me to do exactly what I was saying of zooming out. I was there, like doing interviews, living the moment, grasping everything I could in terms of the environment on the ground. But when I got back, it was important to me to zoom out and understand the scale of this channel, of this scar. I understood how big would be the diversion of water and how directly the indigenous territories would be affected. Plus, it was an interactive feature in the story. So just before we jump on Google Earth Pro, I want to mention what kind of data formats we will be working. And for this session and the next sessions with Kang on Monday, you also gonna probably use most of the time these formats. There are more formats, but these are the most common ones. When talking about geodata, you either working with vector data, which are points, lines, polygons, or you working with imagery, which are the raster. And so for vector, we'll find tables, which are the comma separated values, the famous CSV or Excel tables or simple text tables. You will find a lot of spreadsheets around with locations. You also will find something that we call a shapefile. The acronym is SHP. GPX is the format for GPS, or GeoJSON is another format that you will see around. And another one very common is one's called KML or KMZ. They're the same thing. The Z stands for the compressed file. And these are common formats of Google Earth, Google Maps, because I don't know if you heard this before, but the company who created Google Earth was called Keyhole, and they created the whole language. So Keyhole markup language is KML, and still, after being bought by Google, is still the format that is used. And here's our first exercise. If you go, I will show here. I know this is not such a long session, but if you want to follow with me using this folder here, part 1 Google Earth Pro, I'm gonna show you how to upload some of these files in Google Earth. If you have any basic doubts on how to use Google Earth, please go on and put your question on the chat or open your mic. But again, this is a very useful tool. I have to apologize myself that I try many times yesterday to change from Spanish to English my menu here, but I don't know why it didn't work. So I guess I will have to tell you like that. If you have your Google Earth open with you, you have my places here and temporary places instead of these words in Spanish. Again, I'm really sorry for that. I couldn't find out how to change. But what you need to know is that all files with those formats that I just mentioned are you are able to open here by basically going on files, which is probably the name of this first menu, and open. And what we're gonna do is first going on this open and bring a KML file, which is called the Xingu track, which is exactly the track that I show you on the Xingu River of the Belo Monte Dam. So if I open this track, which I brought from my GPS or my Wikilog, I get those 100 kilometers trip that I was just telling you about, right? So my first instinct, whenever I start looking and zooming out from the trip I just did, is to use a tool that is in the top icons here, which is a historical imagery tool, which is a clock with this green arrow on the top. So if you click on this clock, it starts bringing you historical imagery of that place. Updated one, and already you can see the whole hydroelectric power dam ready. You see that place where we went and show. Yeah, they're available, Idila. I can easily place the link here, which is I have my hand. So on this Google Drive, you can use. So the first one I open is the Xingu track, and you'll see. And then after that, I use the clock to show the historical imagery. So this is how it is now, the hydroelectric power plant. Look at the channel that I was just mentioning. You know, bringing water here creates another reservoir, and the turbines are actually here. They're small, so it's for engineers, it's considered a super project because it does have a reservoir here and brings water to this other reservoir and then generates energy twice, here and here. The problem is what is happening here with this part of the river, because the river was flowing this way. And you can see there's no more water. It gets down here, but the water just disappeared. If you use the satellite imagery historical, I can go back to the place before it was constructed in 2006, and you see a, oops, sorry. Any imagery before the construction, you see a totally different river. So you see the islands, you know, that were all the forests. You don't see the channel. You see the water flowing down here. And for me, it was essential. The next layer I'm gonna add, I'm gonna go back here on file and open, going back to my folder. It's gonna be the indigenous territory that is there. But if I use the KML, it's not gonna work because it's a shape file. So if you know the name of the files you're using, is just go here and you see Google Earth accepts many formats, including shapefile, which is very common on many of the open data repositories. I'm pretty sure the open data repositories of your country might have shapefiles. Among platforms for specifically the Southeast Asia region, I know Open Development Mekong and the platform of infrastructure tracker, I think it's from this Stinson Foundation. I recently saw their tools for mapping deforestation and infrastructure in Southeast Asia. They all use shapefiles and these formats that I mentioned also, KML and spreadsheets. So the shapefile will show me the file here. One tip with shapefile to start, I'm pretty sure Kane will go over this again on Monday when talking about GPS, is that shapefile is not one file. It needs to be on a folder. So you see here like the folder indigenous territories. I can only see the file of shapefile, but here also there are other 4 files, including the projection of the layer, the database of the layer. So all these files needs to be in one single folder. For QGIS, you can use them zipped, compressed, but here on Google Earth, you need to unzip and use just the shape file. And if I add this to my map, it should, okay. It will show me the indigenous land that is in here. Another layer for us to compare. So you can have a perspective of how bad the situation was for this indigenous territory after the construction of the hydroelectric dam. So they got all their water from the river, all their livelihoods basically, but now it's how it is, you know, like they block here. You see the river barely runs into their land after the construction. This is the kind of context that I'm proposing you seek for when telling the story of a place, when reporting about the environment. What other layers can I consider here? I could, for example, I'm gonna open the forest fire layer. For example, I know I had one here is called Focos de Queimadas. I'm using a database from the Brazilian government, but you can easily find this on NASA web. Why it's not showing anything? I'm going to go and use CSV. Where are you? CSV. Generic text. CSV. Now I have my spreadsheet here, but look how interesting this is. When you use spreadsheets, they will open the dialog. Let me know if you're not seeing the dialog window here. And I'm gonna ask you to geocode the spreadsheet. What is geocode? It's basically telling the software which columns of your spreadsheet has the location data. And that's a very important skill to have it, because there's many softwares, including QGIS or Google Maps or Google Earth or other mapping softwares, that they always go into this process of geocoding. If you have a spreadsheet with addresses, that's your location column, and you tell the software, this is the column with my location. I want you to identify the coordinates of these addresses, and that's very useful. In our case here, what we're saying is that the comma is what's separating the columns, so it's fine, it's look good. I'm seeing that UTF-8 will work for my Portuguese spreadsheet, but here's the one. It's asking what are the columns that are equal to longitude and latitude. Luckily, this spreadsheet has exactly these two columns, latitude and longitude. So I'm just saying, like, the latitude field is latitude, the longitude field is longitude. That makes things much easier. And once I decided, he's telling me, like, this spreadsheet has more than 2,500 points. Do you want to import everything, or you just want to import part of it, just like a sample? I'm gonna import a sample, but you can work with as much. Here is asking if I want to use some kind of a graphic model, which I don't. As the forest fires are working for the whole Brazil, is flying over. So these are forest fires or burnings of vegetation in all the country. But let me approach again my area. Well, there's not much, but there's some that were registered in the surroundings, and that was one of the main questions emerging from this hydroelectric power plant that was driving more deforestation and more degradation of the land. And I can keep going and going and creating more layers to understand and to tell the story. From this, I will work on creating final products to my audience. That's going to be an interactive map. Maybe it will be something that would allow people to do their own exploration. Google Earth, it's good for doing one thing to export. It allows to do some of those films, you know, like they have this other tool here, which is a camera, which allows you to record your, you can record any movements you do, or you can create a kind of a virtual 3D, you know, this kind of thing. You can create it from here or from other tool that's called Google Earth and Google Earth Studio, sorry, which makes better renderized imagery for television. If you work with television, I would recommend you use Google Earth Studio for creating these virtual tours. But that's one option. I really like using here for some kind of analysis. You can even, you know, like measure things. You have the ruler here. If I want to, for example, measure the size of the dam, I can use the ruler and I can see, look, the wall of the dam has 3 kilometers. It's not super accurate. It's not for scientific research, but I can give you an idea of the dimension and the scale, the spatial dimension of that area. Same for, you know, like if I want to measure a polygon, this is a new deforestation. I want to measure, I can see this has 600 square meters, this area of deforestation, and so on and so on. Of course, once you get more and more in the story, more accurate you will be using this. So one thing that I want to ask you to try which is easy, is to get to this other website. It's called Earth Engine, which has the same kind of imagery that we were looking on Google Earth, but it's on your browser and creates this time lapse. So why don't you go on the search bar and put that place that I ask you to think about and see if you can see some changes. If I look at Belo Monte, the hydroelectric power plant, it's going to take me there and show those changes I was just mentioning. To give it a try. Yeah, thanks, Nora. I would do the same. Go to this website and see. Here's really loading my internet. I don't know. It's not loading the imagery that I was expecting, but try. Go on the search bar and just put a place and see if you see something interesting. Yeah, my image is not so good. I'll try another one here. Yeah, I think my internet's not rendering the imagery so fast. Oh, here we go. Yes, there's one is another case of hydroelectric power plant that was created in an area and all the deforestation that was surrounding that area over the years. So in almost 40 years, that's what happened with this place in another part of the Brazilian Amazon. And you can, as I suggested, take a look on your places that of your interest and see if you can see changes. And I think this is a start for many stories. And from this, you can start trying to calculate the size of these changes, what are the drivers, and then starts the journalist, what are the drivers, what were the laws, what were the actors and conflicts that were driving the change in the territory. Anyone would like to share what they saw? Anything interesting about the place you thought? Any surprises? Anyone? Okay. Feel free to share at any moment. It's useful while doing your visualizations and might be really interesting to use Google Earth is to create those before and after. Thanks, Nora. Nora is telling us about the development on the edges. Yeah, that's a classic, right? You have a refugee, a protected area, then the degradation goes up to the border. The other thing that I propose you can use Google Earth for is to save images. Basically, if you want to show like before, like this was before the construction, this was after. What you can do is like putting on the before moment and oops, let me drag this down and save image. There's an icon here on the right, or even in the files, there's an option of save image. But here on the icon, if you click on save image, it will save this, and then you go to the next one and save. And you get these two files and you simply publish them side by side, or you can use a tool that's called Juxtapose or Flourish, as we see on the Makoko, that creates those slider that you can slide one picture to the other. We'll look at it Sentinel, which allows to do this as well, but that's a classic narrative with satellite imagery that we've been seeing nowadays, how things have changed before and after. And you can do this by by obtaining pretty much high resolution imagery from Google Earth. All right, any doubts on Google Earth? I will move on and show other tools. Hopefully you had some fun using the time lapse. So this was our exercise number 1. Get any of those files that are in our folder, the folder that we share with you, and start uploading. Just remember that you need to change the type of file to see the files in the folder. So you need to download from the Google Drive, having in your computer, and then open on Google Earth as a normal file, just open, but then select, I want to open a GPX, I want to open a KML, and so on and so on, shapefile, CSV. And then you can start overlaying many of these indicators, either it's deforestation, forest fires, and protected areas. All right, second part of our training, I'll show you the Sentinel imagery. Sentinel is a satellite from the European Space Agency. And they have, well, the Sentinel is the sensor, the satellite is called Copernicus, but they have this EO browser, observatory browser, which is in this link that will take you to this tool here. You actually, it's a good idea to make a login, but you can play around without it as well. And you will see kind of the mindset, as I mentioned, or the logic. It's always this: you activate layers, and this layer is going to show up in your map. That's so common with the language of digital mapping that you won't have any issues of navigating several tools, and when you go and work with QGIS, it's going to be the same. So here you also have to search for a place. I'm going to search Pahang in Indonesia. Oh, I'm sorry, Malaysia, which is a recent place that we've been working, and there was a great story published by our colleague that I know you met, Yahwa from Malaysia in this area. So once I decided the area, it focused on the map, and then you have many options. Even the Landsat, which is the same imagery that you were seeing in Google Earth time lapse, it's available here. But we want to work, even by default, already brings Sentinel-2, which is the optic sensor with more recent imagery available. And it's nice to use the advanced search because it allows you to control the amount of cloud coverage that you want. So I'm going to use, I don't know, even less, 3%. And once you search, it's good to maybe ask for 1 year of imagery. And once you search, starts creating this overlays of here. And that's the thing. I'm going to compare maybe this one from 2021 with another one from 2020. The nice thing about Sentinel, it does have a several analysis or index, kind of a color analysis, if you like, to help you on analyzing those imagery. I'm seeing this one might not be the best one for me. Let me try another one. Let's see this one. Yeah, that one might work. One thing, if we're working with forest, that is very useful is this vegetation index. that show, it gives you a better view of vegetation. So if I use this color here, I can compare, get really close areas with more clarity, because it shows like the polygons, for example, of these areas. If I get really close, I can see it better. Areas that probably have changed over the years. These are very interesting patterns, for example, that I show some kind of activity by knowing very little, and I'm just doing an exercise here. I know this is probably a pattern of palm oil plantations, and that's already an interesting thing to see. But what you can also do is compare this with other years. So if I click here, add to compare, it brings here, and I can go back and find an imagery from 2020, for example, which didn't come. I think I was too ambitious on my cloud coverage. I'll put it a little bit more and see if I can get the 20. Here we go. And now I'll be looking at the imagery of 2020. Yeah, so the true color is showing, we can see how is the area of plantation, but I want to compare the vegetation index, NEDVI, an important index for using. And this is the 2020, and I will compare with 2021. Okay. Let's see what's going on. So if there's no much change. I can see this area down here has grown a little bit, right? So I can use this slider. So the one I'm looking at is 2020. So if I start taking it down, I can see 2021. There's maybe too much cloud on 2021, but I can see this area on the middle. It was harvest, maybe. It was green, and then it's not green anymore. But there's more here on this. Oh, look at this area on the left, this one here. This was last year. This was this year. I don't think it's clouds. It looks like deforestation. Yeah, it is deforestation. So you can see how this is useful, right? If you were looking at a very, very locate area, you can see pretty clear. And that you can export and use it in Google Earth. I'm gonna just open myself. I won't ask you to open. Let's see if it's gonna go fast. So if I use TIFF, which is the format of an image, no, it's not giving me the option. Or is oh, sorry. Yeah, for it's KML. Just 1 sec, sorry. It's this one. You actually can export as a KML as well. Yeah, it didn't load. I'm sorry. I thought it would load. There's something of the connection. But anyway, you cannot, there was an example of showing an overlay in an area with a lot of deforestation, but you can do easily by exporting images from Sentinel. So if you have these images here in Sentinel and you would like to work then in another software, you can download them. On the right, there is this option of download, and look at what the options are. JPEG, which allows you to do the before and after that I told you. But if you go to analytical, you can opt to download the KMZ, which is what I try to do now, but you can download a KMZ and open it on Google Earth, or you can have a TIFF image that opens on Google Earth as well, or QGIS. So pretty straightforward. The other thing that you can do using Sentinel is to create the time lapse right here. So you can create using this film icon here. It will allow you to get the images and create a time lapse. This one is kind of boring because there's just 2 images, but you can do with 3, 4 images, and it exports already as a GIF, and then you can put it straight away in your website. So it gives you this square ready to be used. It's quite interesting. So Sentinel is good for medium resolution imagery, although considering the size of changes that happen in rainforests in our regions, both Amazon, Southeast Asia, really enough for seeing these changes. So you can get these images, download them, do before and after, create and create GIFs directly here, and apply the NDVI index, which is easier to see changes in the vegetation. Any doubts on Sentinel? I know I'm going a bit fast, but if you have doubts, I can hold a little bit more here. Okay, so this was Sentinel. Oh. Okay, how do you credit? You see, Nora, that when I created the GIF, it already came with the credits in it. So it giving it here Copernicus Sentinel Hub. For Google Earth is the same. If you export imagery from Google Earth, it will be tagged with the Google logo. If you by any chance you get those imagery without a logo, they require you to mention that that imagery was obtained in Google Earth, and that's fine because they're paying for the imagery. If you get any other kind of screenshot, it's always from other tools that I might not be going over here. It's always worth mentioning the provider. Either is NASA or the agency. I like, because I just love these things, but I like to go really in details. What is the sensor? So what I sometimes write a small caption saying like, this is sensor Sentinel-2 satellite Copernicus European Space Agency, just to give an idea, especially when you're dealing with forest fires and deforestation. It's quite useful to mention these details. Do we have to pay for using in our publications? Not these ones. None of them you have to pay. What you have to pay sometimes is if you're using an API, which will be a link, a service connected to your website, and you're consuming imagery and load and reload, and then sometimes there's limits for this use. For example, Google Maps, you can use it for free embedded in your website up to, I think it's 25,000 views per day. It's quite a lot, but I don't know, if you work in the biggest newsroom of your country, 25,000 views in one story per day might not be impossible, right? So in that case, Google either is going to contact you and say like the owner of that account and say like you have to pay to keep seeing this map, or they're going to take your map down. It happens sometimes. an interactive map, then imagery global and Google Earth. And also you can find some planet imagery in use, but the planet imagery, it's not available for free. So the very high resolution imagery that it's more and more coming out, they're all being closed. It's a big business, but they're good on doing partnerships with journalists. That's good news. They want journalists to use this. So there's so many good stories nowadays using planet imagery, and I'm pretty sure they were given for free. Let me go on my next tool. Anytime you have questions, please just let me know. So I actually wrote planet here, but I should have wrote word view, which is the other one, which is a free one. So word view looks a little bit intimidating, but it's just awesome. It's an awesome tool by NASA. And the good thing about WorldView is basically brings all NASA data available, environmental satellite data in one place. So if you click here, add layers, you can see all the layers they have. It's pretty amazing. So they have air quality, ash, and plumes, drought, dust storms, fires, shipping, it's floods, smoke, vegetation. It's pretty daunting. It's amazing, actually. Dams, everything they map, it's available here. And why this is useful? I think it's especially useful for our regions. You might want to work. So these images that you are seeing, they're kind of updated real time of the whole globe. But you can also use the layer management here to not being so overwhelmed with, and just use something like this. And then add other layers like fires, right? So, and then you will see fires. You see that I'm looking at 2019 because I know it was a year of many fires. So you get the fires historically here. You can move to the date of today, actually. But I know it's not actually the fire season. So I can see the fires here on that August 12, 2019. And if I go back and activate the satellite imagery, I might see even smoke. Yeah, there is some haze on, you can see there is clouds, but there's haze that I'm pretty sure are visible from coming from forest fires. And one of the reasons I use this date is because I know this were exactly the moment when big fires in Brazil and people were crazy and there was all this outcry about Bolsonaro and things, but look how bad it was on those days. You know, like you can really see the images of those days with smoke coming out of the ground. Look, it's pretty for Info Amazonia, and I was using a lot of these images. And the great thing about this platform is that they allow you to take a snapshot right here. So you say like, oh, one of these images, you can choose the size of it, and you can download it right here. It's so easy. You also can download the data, and you would get TIFF, and you're going to get camel, all those formats that I just mentioned, and you can write this image as a base layer for your map, and start tagging, putting your story on the top, or writing annotations. Maybe you want to overlay indigenous territories, and so on and so on. And yeah, so this is WorldView. I found super interesting also to mix with, for example, carbon monoxide, which is such an important measure, prior to the emissions of carbon dioxide, but shows pollution, how this is particulate that would affect people's health. So you can have an idea of concentration of pollution caused by the fires as well, which was what forensics architecture was using. So here you see the overlay of carbon monoxide with the plume and the fires. And again, by combining the layers, you get a much better sense of the dynamic of that environment. And these are the tools I would like to share with you today. Maybe we could have time for some questions. If you have any ideas of stories, you would like some tips, you can also give me a feedback if this is actually useful for your work. And remember, we have one more session with my colleague Kang on Monday. Thank you. That's it for now, and let's hear from you. It's a huge group. Thank you. Let me see the question. Oh, I think I mentioned the one for the payment, Nora. As I said, like the ones I just showed, they're all free. Just be aware of Planet that I haven't shown, but it's the one who is providing high resolution imagery these days that they sometimes charge. But it's easy to get a deal for your outlet. Being a journalist, I really recommend you reach out to many of these tools. They all have kind of a press liaison officers, something like this, and you can say like, look, my newsroom want to use satellite imagery. Do you have any training, any products that you can share? That's really common. I'm reading Febrianti question. Interesting, Febrianti. So Google Earth doesn't have good imagery. There are issues like we saw in Makoko in Nigeria of areas that are not properly mapped, or there are areas where the cloud coverage is so thick over the year that they never managed to have a huge data set of satellite imagery. Few things that I recommend. Take a look on Sentinel and see how it goes there, because they keep mapping there all the time. I think even if you don't have imagery, you can go to Global Forest Watch and try to see what kind of indicators they have for that area. Are there mining concessions? Are there palm oil concessions? What's the rate of deforestation? Because Global Forest Watch does measure deforestation for the whole globe for the past 10 years. So we would be able to see if there's a trend of increase of deforestation in one specific area easily. And then again, the layer mindset, start bringing the layers. What are the protected areas? What are the indigenous territories? What is the forest fire in the past 24 hours or more? That's the initial investigative technique. Just bring all layers, see if you can have a visual clue of what's happening. And from this visual clue, you can start doing analysis, counting things, counting the size of deforestation, counting the size of like invasions in protected areas, the number of forest fires inside a protected area, and so on and so on. What else? Any other questions? Do you think, I'm not seeing anyone, so do you think this is useful for you? Anyone can see applying this in one of their projects? My pleasure, Fabian. Okay. Yeah, so you have the presentation. You were um, invited to go and review. I also bring in here my email in case you have doubts in how to use any of these tools, and I'll be happy to help, and very curious to know about your projects. And this final thank you for you all. If there's no more questions. Great.
Thank you
All
so
right.
much,
So
Gustavo.
thank you, Nora. It was a pleasure.